Welcome back to Half Past Capitalism, where we talk about alternatives to capitalism as if they were possible. This show is part of the Harbinger Media Network. Shylah Wolfe is the executive director of the Concordia Food Coalition, and she has a rich background in cooperative movement, and her work is focused on improving the food system. And that work spans cooperative development, participatory action research, and multi-stakeholder governance. Very pleased to be here with Shylah today. Welcome, Shylah.
Thanks, Dru. Thanks for having me on. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Likewise. So today we're talking about cooperatives and the food system. And I was just wondering if you could just start with a sketch of your involvement and in cooperatives and your interest in food. Sort of, what is your trajectory in that respect?
I definitely started on the food side of things and then moved into the cooperative side of things, at least at the formal engagement level. I mean, I think I learned about communism and socialism at like 7 years old and thought it was pretty rad. But aside from that, I took a job in food out of necessity to pay my way through university. And, I went to school at the traditional route of like being about 18 when I started university and wanted something a little more tactile. So I did finish my degree, but I pursued culinary arts right after. I also worked in food and farming in Southern Ontario, where I grew up all through my life because I'm from the working class and everyone worked on farms in the summer. But yeah, I spent the first half of my adult working life in kitchens and started to feel a lot of strong feelings about the way that kitchens were run and the way that the food was managed throughout the cycle, from purchasing to consumption to waste management. I ended up in tree planting camps for a little while where I started to learn a little bit more about that community level organizing and being a community organizer. And then I stumbled into co-ops coming back to Montreal and getting involved in the neighborhood. I was living in Hochelaga and Centre Sud, so I started with Coop Le Milieu in the formal sense, actually doing catering for them, and saw that overlap a lot in education, food systems, and cooperation. So from there, I just got really interested in the co-op model, started working in food, in co-ops, like being the first food coordinator for the Hive Cafe and helping actually build that co-op. We maybe overbuilt it. And then I went formal with some even more formal in my co-op knowledge with academics. I did a master's certificate in social economy and cooperatives in public policy at the University of Saskatchewan.
And just to get down to like just the super basics of, I guess, just because that sounds like a really rich set of experiences, I guess how would you compare or contrast your experiences working in kitchens and working on farms in sort of a non-cooperative setting, and then the experience in cooperatives? Like, what sparks fly across that gap?
I mean, the farm is just it's not exactly a model. It's a location where production happens, as opposed to like the manner in which it's and the manner in which the labor is organized. But I would say there's a more of an individualist approach to the workplace in general, like at least my experience in those conventional models as opposed to in the cooperative model. But I think that's a mindset too. And the biggest difference I would say, and maybe this doesn't really speak to your question, but the difference I would say is like the entrepreneurial spirit. It doesn't exist as much in the like farming, and actually it does exist in the farming end of things and doesn't really exist in the kitchen, like restaurant kitchen. But in both sides on the co-op and like both environments on the co-op side of things, I think it fundamentally has to. And the most thriving co-ops, both in food, in kitchens and in farming, or in restaurants and in farming, have had strong leaders that treat the organizations like their own, like they own them. But
Right. I mean, would you say that the experience of being a sort of a, I don't know, maybe an entry level worker, or sort of joining a team in the cooperative sector is more like entrepreneurship, is like your entrepreneurial sort of impulse is both more necessary and more validated?
yeah, yeah, I was never very good with authority. I mean, I liked the idea of structure, but the reason I was pulled so quickly towards that, and like I got out of the traditional restaurant industry and the brigade system. I think I lasted about 4 years, but could not stand that my opinions, which I deemed very valid or was willing to debate with others, were not being heeded because of, I don't know, like complacency usually, um, and that I couldn't really make my own decisions, uh, or like collaborate with others to like make a schedule or whatever that made more sense to us. And so I was attracted to the ability to do that and kind of have some sense of ownership, true ownership that felt validated.
And it's not so much that there's not entrepreneurship, it sounds like, on in farms or in private enterprises, but more just that that there's sort of a bigger distance between the ability to make decisions, like whether you're the owner or like manager or anybody else, basically.
Absolutely. I mean, and I spent a lot of intimate time with a farmer that wanted to run his farm, like his very small family farm, more like a cooperative. But he had to make all the decisions. It was a burden for him, but was also just the structure that everybody, like that classic structure that is prescribed. And we often talked about how his entire day, like he had decision fatigue at the end of the day due to the fact that he was responsible for all of the decisions. Because also the pitfall of multiple people making multiple decisions is the left hand not knowing what the right hand is doing, and then having that additional administrative level of like needing some sort of communication system if you're not one human being. So
For sure.
yeah.
So yeah, like obviously transitioning from like one sort of like one person makes all the decisions model, which can be sort of excessively burdensome, to like a collective model, is not actually a necessarily straightforward thing. It there's the sort of in between zone can be very rickety in terms of it being responsive to the needs of the business or anything like that.
And the number of like, I think the nature that's like similar between the restaurant industry and the farming food production industry is just the number of items. Like even if you're a small organization, a small enterprise, um, the risk factors in the food system, are like food uh, sector, are really really high. You know, an average small family farmer is going to do 50 to 90 varieties of vegetables or crops, if they're doing vegetables anyway. They cannot exactly specialize in one or two items. So their inventory management, the level of intricacies and complexities required in cooperation, I think it like shoots up. Whereas like maybe a financial services co-op, you know, they could have like 6 products and do it really well, and not have as many. And those things don't expire or go bad. You know, they don't have as many challenges as food service providers do. So how cooperation is done in food service in terms of like the level of communication required on a daily basis is maybe like extra challenging or extra important and therefore higher risk.
We exist in a globalized food market, and I mean, what we want to talk ultimately today about is food systems. I just wanted to sort of start out with a bit of your direct experience, to ground the conversation a bit. But I want to get into the stratosphere here pretty quickly as well. So we exist in a global food market, and I think we have to acknowledge the sort of tremendous scale of the crisis that we face when it comes to food. And so I guess as I see it, and I'm saying this, you know, so that you can disagree if you want to, but also just to sort of tee up the next question.
Yeah.
The global food system has a short-term crisis and a long-term one. So you have the war in Ukraine, obviously, is sort of a major, or a flashpoint anyway, in terms of it affecting food supply, and directly in terms of like the amount of wheat that comes out of Ukraine, but also fuel prices because of sanctions on Russia. And then, of course, that sort of global ripple through the market has been seized upon by distributors and grocery chains to further raise prices. So that's where the sort of direct experience comes in of like most people with the food system. And I feel like that's starting to get, and and you're starting to see food shortages in certain parts of the world. But then the long-term crisis seems to me to be a lot more of that, like a much more intense version of that. So you have everything from crop failure because of climate change to mass migration, people like just leaving certain regions of the world because there's no food. Regional famines, certainly higher prices, and then the same basically layer of investors seeking to profit from all of that by speculating on land, speculating on food, and so on. So that's all unavoidably grim. But I guess coming down from that global scope to the work that you do, sort of in trying to address the food system, what do you think cooperatives? How do cooperatives fit into this giant mess that we're in? How do they, like, what can they contribute? What can they do?
Yeah, great question. And I don't fundamentally disagree with anything that you just mentioned. The mechanized, industrial global food system is quite linear and all pervasive in that there are major ripple effects that happen from the war in Ukraine that actually creates manufactured famines, to how that affects us here in North America, and so-called Canada. The thing that I think has always attracted me to cooperatives at that larger scale and that societal scale is how their capacity to help us develop parallel systems, like their models, their structures and mechanisms, and essentially like a sort of a template of how we could better organize ourselves to have some autonomy and agency and ownership over how our food systems are run. But like they're demonstrable structures that we can use, and then reapply and reframe based on our regions and our like natural resources, the assets, and the 8 kinds of capital that we have. And most co-ops, although they might like focus on one kind of stakeholder, are often, any economy is multi-stakeholder, but I think co-ops attempt to acknowledge the multi-stakeholderism of an economic system, and food is inherently multi-stakeholder. So I also focused a lot on multi-stakeholder or solidarity co-ops in my research for that reason. But yeah, essentially they can help. They're one intermediary step and mechanism or tool for helping us to develop those parallel systems, both economic systems and foodway or value chain systems, because they're kind of like the recipe. Like they tell you what ingredients you need, and they help build or give us some structure via a recipe. But ultimately, it's up to the region or the bioregion and the humans and the capital that those humans hold to put into place what makes sense. Just there's a prescription there. So I believe that the parallel systems are what is necessary to move away from and divest from the global food supply chain and develop resiliency within regions that can also cooperate with each other. Like it's just an incredibly scalable model.
I was going to sort of, in this in this chat, I was going to like move up, go from sort of land to distribution to consumption to waste, but I think I actually want to bring waste up to the top, because I feel like the characteristic of a market-based global food system where you basically have food as commodity that gets traded across continents and shipped around creates this tremendous amount of waste, in terms of, because you're trying to provide like the perfect fresh produce for this like affluent consumer, in the global north, basically. But then you also have to be, because the market has to provide that perfect sort of experience, that perfect consumer experience, but at the same time has to basically preserve the scarcity of that commodity. You end up just discarding just gigantic amounts of food. And obviously that becomes sort of patently obscene when you have people literally starving to death in other places in the world, or at least severely hampering their development through malnutrition, which is in some ways almost more horrifying. But can you talk a little bit about food waste and how that fits into the system, and how, I guess, what a cooperative version of dealing with food waste would look like?
The movement towards like also consuming ugly produce is at least a step to like a sign that culture is shifting away from that somewhat. But I think, like you mentioned at the beginning, at the top of your comment for around waste, is that the movement around of food also brings about a lot of waste, or we could even speak about waste more broadly as those negative externalities. Those are costs, not necessarily waste, but they come together. Waste is a negative externality of the global system that requires moving around of food so much from like by vast distances. So a cooperative version of waste would, or a cooperative version of solutions to waste would actually be pretty similar, in my opinion, to the cooperative solution to the distribution challenges that most food systems, like regional and otherwise, actually face. I think they have to go hand in hand, because I mean, ultimately, we would have to stop dumping. We would have to stop producing mass amounts of something in one location that doesn't meet the needs of the people in that location. Yeah, more cooperation around distribution should ideally reduce a lot of waste, and just generally producing more food in the region wherein it's going to be consumed will reduce that too, which hopefully would be also by co-ops. It's so hard to just talk about waste. I can't do it.
That's fair. It's it obviously, and everything is going to, I mean, I was trying to formulate the questions based on these discrete things, and obviously like they immediately bleed out, because if you're going to talk about waste, you have to talk about where you're going to like reintegrate all this biomass into like a living system that is producing food.
And
so of course that means talking about land. So
yeah, no, sorry. And if it's like at the industrial level, and I don't just mean the industrial level of like the large corporate system, but like at the like farmer level versus the consumer or individual level. I do have some like, to paint a picture though of, I love the idea of community gardens and community compost systems. And I guess I got a lot of my training in permaculture design as well, in terms of like systems thinking. So I thought it would be great that there would be not only a community garden in every community, kind of like Venn diagrams, but massive community composters that I also wanted them to like generate heat and help contribute to snow removal. And yeah, like possibly hot water for community centers, and doing the same at the farm level is possible. But often farms that I work on, small family farms, they don't really have waste. Like that's not a thing. There has to be animals involved in these systems as well. So why we wouldn't have that at the policy level for inside communities, allowing for some of the common, the usual suspects like chickens, goats, small carbon footprint animals, like we do at the farm scale. Like we would reduce our waste a lot, and we wouldn't need, if we remove that fetishized, like what's it called, the unification, the commodity being everything's the same, uniformity, there's the word I was looking for. If we remove that uniformity fetish for real, and have more bioregional purchasing, and use animals in like agroecological practices, and have those agroecological practices within our communities, I think we will not have a conversation about waste anymore. Rather, a conversation about efficient distribution.
We're not talking about waste anymore. We're just talking about
trade agreements between regions, like small, like okay. if there is a surplus of a crop in one region, so much so that it would be inefficient to compost it, then there's just then the challenge is how to distribute and trade that with another region in an efficient way. And I don't think that would be a huge challenge. Rather, it's a challenge of technology and communication.
Mm-hmm. But it also sounds like you're saying we need, I mean, not to be too flip about it, but like a herd of goats in every neighborhood.
I mean, yeah, we're probably creeping back into that ideal scenario. But yeah, like low footprint, literal like space geographical footprint as well as carbon footprint animals in neighborhoods is not outlandish in my opinion, so long as the population is educated on how to care for them. Like having larger spaces for food production in every neighborhood plus animal husbandry in those neighborhoods would would be worth it and wouldn't be an enormous transition in my opinion. I mean, we've seen goats in Parc Pelican. We've loosened those bylaws about chickens. We're getting there slowly. And their waste, like their excrement, isn't waste either. It's just part of the large community compost system.
Indeed, which brings us, I guess, to land. My original structure can now be restored, but yeah, let's talk about land. I mean, you tell me more, but it sounds like land. It's like almost impossible for farmers to like somebody who's an entry level sort of coming out of high school or university and wants to become a farmer. Like, how are they going to do that? Mm-hmm. It's almost impossible, except if they inherit land or they have some kind of nest egg that they can use to buy land. But it doesn't actually commercially make sense with land prices being what they are to farm. So yeah, I guess what are the sort of immediate things that need to happen to deal with that, and then we'll get into the sort of ideal version.
I mean, certainly policy around the speculative and investment nature, like the institutional investing in land for profit, is a huge contributing factor to why land is like purchasing of land and agricultural land is prohibitive for our generation and everyone after us. The solutions that I've seen working and have helped to facilitate with the work I've been doing is usually around land trust, removing land from the speculative market. But that also is like really costly and requires, a community, like a village, to move mountains to make it happen. A lot of young people I know are forming cooperatives simply to be able to get access to land by pooling their money to buy something small, or taking on leases of land that they can do more reasonably because there are more people. So yeah, in the immediate term, that is one of the best ways. And you have to work with a cooperative bank in order to do things like that, because most other financial service providers are very wary of a limited liability partnership, engaging in an enterprise like farming and like large land space without enormous cash down payment. So getting land trusts and getting grants for land trusts and agricultural trusts is one of the best ways for communities to get access to land, or like groups of people to do so. It also means though that they don't own the land, so they don't get a cash benefit in terms of an investment if ever they leave it, which isn't exactly a problem, but I can understand how it can feel like a barrier to certain people that are essentially they're working to get access to the means of production, but they don't technically own the means of production. They own the governance to the means of production, which is an interesting concept and is sometimes a little bit too socialist for certain farmers. But yeah, those are the immediate term. Obviously, policy changes and the liberation of these, the rentier class ownership of land would be like the dream, and something that I have mused about, but I certainly don't want to pretend to know enough about, is the idea of truly designated agricultural zones in a way that is maybe similar or just inspired by the conservation easements that exist of restoring natural lands. As I think you already know, and we've talked about, there's some colonial undertones to that are very problematic, but I think it's worth exploring what that does, or what kind of temporary benefits that can have to restoring like pieces of land in populated areas back to food production, so that we are cutting the distribution like length of time, that part of the food cycle, to be shorter. I think it's important, and would like just generally increasing that supply should reduce the price and the access barriers that people that want to grow their own food are having. So more land trusts within cities that are dedicated to food production. And certainly rethinking what land is, like buildings, long-term buildings should, especially in urban spaces, should have the structural capacity to have useful rooftops, you know, and vertical growing being another way of seeing like space and the ability to like transform some of those derelict spaces into that kind of land that maybe urban people that want to grow food but aren't willing to move out into the countryside to do so would be able to use their technological skills or passions to produce food. And that would be a different kind of land option, and grants for that. Like I think the government of Canada is making some moves. I mean, the local food infrastructure fund has released many millions of dollars over the last 3 or 4 years towards innovative ways of growing and producing and creating access to food and to land. But all of those policies usually say, and probably because of the speculative nature, that you cannot purchase land, like a capital asset such as land, with these grants, unless it's specifically for an easement or a land trust that you've gotten a grant for. Like, but the majority of them don't allow that. So I think there's a fundamental rethinking of how funding is given would be a big part of the intermediary step too.
Sorry, so they are giving money to land trusts, but not to private ownership, or did I not understand that correctly?
I don't think that every time I've read the local food infrastructure fund eligibility, or like which like cost eligibility, there was no like land purchases were not, that kind of capital cost was not allowed. I mean, there are sometimes grants or fundraising efforts specifically to get land trusts, but I don't think that like a lot of the funding that I know about for food production prohibits land purchases as part of it. Even the Quebec MAPAC grants for like students that come out of the Cégep, like the technique for farming technician, or like gestionnaire, like manager of a farm, they can get up to like $50,000 or $70,000 from MAPAC as a grant. But it's never, you're not allowed to use it for land purchases. It has to be for equipment purchases. And in hand, what happens because of like that nature, I don't know what the word for this is, and I'd love for somebody to tell me, but producers of those kinds of like equipment or something that is often funded by the government inflate the price artificially, because they know that everybody that is purchasing it from them is getting the money from the government. So
yeah, the NFU or the National Farmers Union actually did a study on this, where they basically said, oh, the price of wheat goes up a little bit, and then you see the price of tractors go up like in proportion to that. So it just tracks any sort of like any kind of price advantage or any kind of opportunity for farmers to make money. Then they just end up paying it out through the monopolized sort of input suppliers.
Oh, and to get me on a rant about that, like major policy changes that are continuing to put food producers in debt that must happen, is essentially like the long and short of some of the research that's been done is that the government is facilitating a transfer of wealth from the public to the banks through food and through subsidies. Essentially, farmers are going into, millions of dollars of debt each year higher. It's increasing by, I can't remember all the figures, but I've done a presentation on it. And the subsidies given to those farmers for like debt relief that come from taxpayers is just a little bit under what is actually given, or what is actually taken out by loans each year. And then the interest that's paid on that as well. But you can effectively see, if you cut out the farmer middleman, it's taxpayers giving money to the banks. And the reason that farmers are not capable of keeping their of like making enough money from their livelihoods, because also like 80% of farmers work off farm as well, is because of this. Well, because of globalization and the pressure to commodify and export their product, and also due to the fact that the infrastructure required, because you have to scale in order to make it cost enough or be cost effective. Like, in order to be a commodified export product, you have to scale very high, and that's the only way you can actually make any money. And they're just in this like debt cycle, hoping to hit the jackpot in a way. Anyways, excuse my tangent there, but it's it was. I thought it was
no. It strikes me as central to the whole sort of thing that we're talking about here, which is that the market makes farming non-viable, but then the like system steps in to make it just viable enough that we don't have like a total collapse, but farmers are still going into debt, and young farmers basically aren't able to do anything unless they, go into debt or inherit land, basically.
And older farmers aren't able, even if their values align with the cooperative practices and the next generation of farmers, they can't afford to retire without selling those assets at the same rate that they went into debt for them. So, I actually know I was close with a woman that she just raised the funds for the legal fees of turning her 200-acre land into a land trust, and ultimately had no retirement funds because of that, because she was a farmer. Like, they were a poor farming family all their life, but she believed that it was the third agricultural community land trust in Quebec that was ever actually incorporated. It's a pretty new concept of land trust. But it's a really difficult decision, and an incredibly generous one, that a retiring farmer would have to make, short of a conversion with a payment plan that essentially acts as a retirement plan, which I think La Arterre and Protecteur in Quebec are attempting to help facilitate. That's promising, but there's little other alternatives for
sort of like a reverse mortgage, but for a good cause instead of the bank's cause.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, I guess in terms of land, we were sort of talking about the short term that whole time. You have land, the need for land trust, the need, obviously, if you're talking about being able to, either buy land at market rates or give farmers the ability to retire and pass on their land without sacrificing their well-being in their elder years. Like, you need orders of magnitude more than like millions of dollars. You need like a fundamentally rethink the whole property regime, really. So I guess where would a massive increase in like land trusts and sort of a decommodification of land at the sort of local food production level, at least, like, where would that lead in terms of the kind of governance regime that we would see for land that's used for food production?
Yeah, we would hope, that there would be a more active cooperative movement around like cooperative land management by region. I think I'm wary to suggest that the state should be that it should all be state-owned agricultural production land, rather, just like the ICA principles, like it should be, and the food sovereignty model, it should be managed and run, like managed and governed by the people that benefit from it. So certainly more land focused on food production, I believe, would be necessary in the long term. Like more equitable distribution of that, and that those spaces, there's probably going to be multi tiers. And again, it's a parallel system, so theoretically it could have some similarities to municipal and regional government bodies, but ideally it would be much more democratic, and there would be a little less bureaucratic red tape, though. So we would see a lot more of those opt-in cooperative land management models that sort of overlap by regions, and then have maybe second tier and third tier administrative structures to help with some efficiencies and communication, and probably some sort of, well, like cost sharing as well. I think that would be a better model, at least for the North American communities that I'm familiar with. But I don't believe I would be willing to speak to like the greater global scale. I think every nation or community would have some differences, of course. And
so effectively, you're talking about communal ownership, and then so I guess in that system, who gets to till the land, as it were.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like I believe there would probably be some sort of meritocracy, but there are some challenges with how, like, if there's any sort of inheriting of space. I am wary of the regulatory systems that exist, although they exist in capitalism right now, but like the quota systems of how people are given the permits to grow certain things or produce certain things, because there's possibilities for corruption everywhere. But ideally, with smaller groups of people doing managing of smaller areas and then collaborating with other groups, we would see more honest, democratic, and voluntary, decision making being done about who should do what. But it's like, yeah, it's going to be intricate. I think there would be different decision making systems in each region about how.
I mean, it seems like right now, basically, the way that we decide who gets to use land is like whoever has the most money.
Yeah.
And either is willing to spend that money, or can attract investors by anticipating that they're going to make even more money than anybody else, gets to control the land. And that's how land use is basically decided. I mean, outside of government land and so on, but like, what are some of the criteria that would come to mind that would be an alternative to that?
Yeah, and what you just said, like the idea that there's whoever has the most money gets to decide what is done with the land, which just seems to be true about most things in our system. That's also loaded with the idea that you have money because you inherited it, because of nepotism, because of privilege and white supremacist structures. In an alternative or a parallel system, that's why I mentioned the idea of a meritocracy. I'm sure some piece of that would come to play, like. In smaller communities that are inherently more cooperative, your reputation says a lot more about you than your money, and your actions and behaviors over time actually give some hint as to whether or not you deserve or should have rights and access to a resource or to an asset. And I think that would be, again, like the caveat is, these will have to be smaller groups of people making these decisions together. But I believe that would be a more holistic alternative to the current way that those assets are triaged.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I guess it seems to me that, like, if you just make it purely democratic, then the trouble with that is probably you're going to get better outcomes than like a for-profit system, but you also run the risk of like incentivizing rather than a merit necessarily, or like the ability to produce the best tasting food for the community or the best quantity of food to meet the needs of the community, you're going to end up with the person who can mobilize the most people to come to the board meeting and be the most cleverly manipulative in their rhetoric. and so you would have to, rather than it just being a pure democratic sort of council structure, you'd have to be like, yes, that, but it's on some kind of, I don't know, constitutional foundation that somehow elevates the incentives that are actually good for the community. So you go through a process of being like, okay, well, what do we actually want? Before we hand this land over to the McGillicuddies, who have long family history in the region and can mobilize all their cousins to come to the council meeting. Like how do we make sure that we are saying, okay, yeah, we're going to evaluate who gets this 20-year lease or whatever of this particular plot based on who's the best beet farmer or whatever, who had the highest score. I don't know, is it who had the highest scores in beet farming college? I don't know.
I think and when I say meritocracy, I think that's probably a shitty word to be using for this, and you're right, there will be politicians that have to be accounted for and regulated in a sense, but I think we need to look to, and I don't want to pretend to understand the customs and decision-making structures of the indigenous ancestors that did manage at least the agricultural ones, or the ones that had a lot of agricultural practices. I am sure there are, and in the global south as well, there are systems of management that don't necessitate property or the owning of land, but are collectively managed, that we could be using and looking to a little bit better to have this conversation. And yeah, I think it has a lot to do with reputation in a different way, but probably wouldn't be as democratic in the sense that you and I are used to in I don't want to say neoliberal, but kind of the way that our system, even our cooperative model and the way that we think about it is structured. That could be better too.
Yeah, I think that point's well taken. I mean, if you throw Robert's rules on top of a consumer economy based on individual accumulation, then you're going to get a certain result. Whereas if you think about building a democratic culture and a democratic society in a holistic way that actually functions, then obviously you're going to end up with something a lot more rich and complex than that.
And we have a lot of unlearning to do, as individuals and as society, to get to a place where we're comfortable with that.
Indeed. So I wanted to maybe we can touch briefly on distribution and consumption. I feel like the two sort of go together. But yeah, you in our previous conversation, you talked about sort of the current model being grow monocrops basically at scale and then ship things around, using tons of fossil fuels being the sort of current model. And you talked about sort of food sovereignty being an antidote, I guess, to that. Can you talk a little bit about what it might look like to have a cooperative distribution system?
A cooperative distribution system, yeah, it would. I think it would still be a hub and spoke model that I've kind of referenced before. That would require many smaller cooperatives also cooperating at a second and third tier level, and I think we would really need to leverage the technology of platform co-ops to make sure that we do this in an efficient way, the communication for distribution happens in an efficient way. But at the first stake is really need to shorten that supply chain immediately. We are going to have to get more comfortable with bioregional diets with some luxuries that come from a little bit further away, but probably not as many of them as we're used to. And that's only it's not even 100 years that our diets have changed to what they are. As much as it will be tough for our generation, if it were to start now, our next generation would likely be comfortable with the diet that they have. And we have a lot of other kinds of technologies that mean we can grow additional crops around here without them becoming invasive species or being incredibly fossil fuel intensive and costly. Like we have passive solar systems and like vertical farm options that probably mean we could have a lot more diverse diets, or return to as diverse of a diet as our ancestors had, but with the kinds of foods we're more familiar with now. But also the distribution model that we have at the moment is insanely costly in a way that isn't necessary. Like the major challenges from refrigeration and obviously the fossil fuels required and the perishability of foods, plus the labor involved in the movement and the technology that's involved. I think we just need to like get a lot smarter and use some of the design systems and permaculture design systems that would mean like you don't have to work against the grain. Like we could be a little more holistic and maybe ship mostly non-refrigerated goods further than 100 kilometers, but use the platform co-op technology that, if we imagined Uber but for for distribution services, and use those kinds of communication platforms, which is what they really are. Like they don't actually move any resources around. They just allow resources to communicate with each other. We would be, if we had the same kind of technology applied to the distribution of goods, and actually about sharing and not about the gig economy, but rather about the sharing economy and about like something that's already going this way or is coming back, I think we would have made a big leap in the inefficiencies that already exist. So those kinds of platforms and systems could be cooperatively owned as well, especially they could be multi-stakeholder. And we do have some examples of that, but they're just at really, really small scale right now. And they're not at the community to community level, But
All right. Yeah, I feel like between those different things, I want to get into grocery stores, but I think we're going to run out of time, so maybe we'll save it for another conversation. But I feel like we're really, it's really helpful to hear your sort of detailed explanations of these things. Because I feel like we get a pretty clear picture of sort of where we need to go. Basically it means like finding ways to relocalize while creating the ability to democratically govern the way food's produced, but also the way land is managed, and the way and sort of what we build on top of that will flow from those things. I guess by way of sort of starting to wrap up, I guess, what do you see as the sort of immediate sort of places where this kind of food movement can get a foothold? Like, is there a place where these policies can start to gain some traction?
Yeah, the reason I work at a university, and especially at Concordia University, is because I have seen that universities are kind of the flashpoints for change, like larger societal change and hopefully also economic change, because there's campus community engagement, there's experimentation, there are literally researchers like documenting the data, and it's kind of a nice little petri dish ecosystem to express, test, and cycle different kinds of solutions and see how they can scale. And that is true for the food system, certainly, because there's like this not quite insular, like there's no such thing as an insular, totally food sovereign nation. But the idea of food sovereignty, which means the right of peoples to like culturally, ethically, and dietarily like appropriate foods, and their right to have control and agency over the production, consumption, and management of those foods, could also be applied to a university in a sense. Furthermore, the improvement in the food system at the university level and localizing of the food system actually builds wealth within the community that it exists within, and that actually bleeds out into the broader like city, especially at Concordia. So it has a significant, socioeconomic effect on the population, not just on campus, but around and directly around the campus. So it is an example, and it has always some of the most clashes of ideologies, but foremost thinkers. They're naturally little think tanks, plus the opportunity to apply these concepts right there, right in front of you. And then those benefits, or those positive externalities, benefit the community around. So, we're trying to build the new food enterprise, which would be an attempt at putting that petri dish into action, where we would build up the local, the infrastructure of the middle, it's called, where there's more local sourcing, that doesn't require that the middle scale farms get bigger or become wholesalers. It's they can continue to have their same kind of market, but they can also get access to this much larger market and learn how to cooperate with them. We can employ and give livable wages to the people right around campus that historically are marginalized or racialized. And we can provide, we can start to use holistic culinary practices instead of frozen, because of the distribution system being so shitty, and therefore the diets are shitty for the people that live on campus, because it's mostly frozen or highly processed goods. The university's already, Concordia in particular, is going away from that, but it's still globalized, and it's still incredibly capital and oil intensive, the way that it's managed. And it's not, there's no agency or empowerment of the people benefiting from the food system or the food services, nor the people that work in it. They don't have any of the means of production. So universities, I think, are a great flashpoint for testing new systems and seeing how they can scale.
Yeah, that definitely a lot of food for thought there, as it were. I guess on the subject of social movements in Quebec and Montreal specifically, one of my favorite things about the student movement, especially in 2012 when there was the massive student strike, was that they would have that sort of immediate demand, stop these immediate sort of cuts that had been announced, but the sort of banner behind them, in terms of their long-term demand, was always education should be free.
Yeah.
Which goes from sort of very practical, achievable demand to a visionary and transformative demand. And I guess I'm curious. I mean, my feeling is that the food movement is always talking about that first demand, that achievable, here's a very practical thing that we need to do right now. We need to get more local food into this anchor institution. We need to reform this thing, or we need to set up this little cooperative over here. But I don't see so much the banner, behind the announcement or behind the sort of campaign. Do you have a sense of what that would be?
That's interesting, because I would say that the idea of the concept of food sovereignty and the definition that was the declaration at the Neo-Lenny Congress or whatever, and then the way that La Via Campesina sort of defines it, that I kind of butchered before, but the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food that's produced ecologically through sustainable practices. I feel that is, and having their own agency over those systems, I feel that is something there isn't a perfect, you can't imagine a snapshot in time where it's okay, we've done it, it's over. There's always going to be evolving cultures, evolving needs of people. And especially with climate change, we will never, I don't think, that's also a grim thing of me to say, but I don't think we're going to get to the end of food sovereignty. In fact, I would say that paralleling the 2012 strikes and the Maple Spring, we have better food practices, and the new food enterprise at Concordia being one of the most practical demands. But the vision of the CFC is food sovereignty on Concordia campus and beyond, and all campuses, which, it feels like a a never-ending goal, like something to strive towards, that the horizon is long, because the more literate we become, both like socially and ecologically, the more we realize that there's violence to be and justice to be addressed.
Great. Well, I think we can leave it there. That's a great note to end on. Thanks so much, Shylah. And do you want to talk about where people can find your work or things that you care about?
Oh yeah, sure. So the Concordia Food Coalition, although we like are Concordia based, works with all kinds of like Quebec and English speaking groups that are doing food system or initiatives. You can find us at www.concordiafoodcoalition.com. And you can reach out to us from the contact list there, or info@concordiafoodcoalition.com. And I also recommend, if you want to learn more about co-ops and the food system and value chain coordination specifically, which is the fancy word for all of these interconnecting regional systems, you can go to localfoodandfarm.coop, where you can become a member of a co-op and join the Pollinators of Change platform, which gives you access to courses about how to transform your business or your idea into a co-op, and learn about value chain coordination and connect with food system actors like community organizers, farmers, and food system experts directly, because it's kind of like a social network, but they have courses and events and stuff like that there. And I sit on the board of that organization. It's a great resource. Yeah, I think that's enough options for now.
Great. Well, thanks again.